Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable, and the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Hello and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Adam Gottschalk and Cantor Fellow at the Australia Institute. 2023 was the hottest year on record, but as the climate crisis gets worse, it's unlikely to hold that record for long. In today's Summer Book Club episode, we're joined by renowned climate scientist and the Australia Institute's Writer-in-Residence for 2024, Dr Joëlle Gergis. Joëlle sat down with Australia Institute Climate and Energy Director Polly Hemming to discuss what rising temperatures will mean for Australia and her quarterly essay, Highway to Hell, Climate Change and Australia's Future. This conversation was recorded on June 28, 2024, as part of our Australia's Biggest Book Club webinar series, and some things may have changed since recording. I hope you enjoy the show.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Joëlle.
Thanks, Polly. It's really great to be here.
So the first thing I want to ask, and this is what strikes me whenever I hear you speak or I read anything of yours, is why are we at the point where climate scientists are having to be policy experts? And by that I mean is that for this essay and for your books, you've had to trawl through policy material to write the essay. You had to analyse the policies that have been proven to work in Australia and in other places. You had to analyse whether Australia's policy response is sufficient. I would have thought that, we don't ask cancer researchers to write health policy. Surely your job stops when you say, hey, governments, climate change is really bad and this is what's causing it. What's gone wrong here?
Yeah, that's a really good question to begin. And I think that for many scientists, we often in the past have felt that if we put our information out there, that it speaks for itself and we don't really have to say anything else. But I guess we're living in an era, and I talk about it in the essay as being the age of consequences. And I guess the traditional role of physical scientists, so people like me that are climatologists or oceanographers, atmospheric scientists, we are really focused on describing those dynamical changes in the climate system. We also look at things like estimating the impacts of climate change, like sea level rise or extreme heat. And these are the sorts of things that you see in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's different volumes, particularly volume 1 and 2. And mitigation or the solutions to climate change have been looked at for a long time by the IPCC, but it's in a different working group. It's in working group 3, and that brings in energy experts. And so that's a bit of a different skill set in truth. So those conversations tend to occur in different places. And I guess that's why we often see this clear distinction between climate and energy debates. And maybe that's also why many of us don't feel comfortable talking about policy, because it's not core business for a lot of climate scientists. And obviously, policy is the role of governments. But we're seeing a real failure of our policymakers. It is just that bad now that scientists like me are now having to become engaged in a conversation and wade into political debates that we aren't always equipped to deal with. But because the stakes are so high, I've really actually felt like there isn't an option. And so that's how I've come to be writing this essay.
Yeah, and thank you for writing it. It is very confronting. I know you have to deal with very confronting subject matter generally as a climate scientist. The essay was to be honest, really hard to read in places. But I didn't put it down feeling despair. I put it down feeling angry, to be honest, because you do present the simple policy solutions, not that you should have to, that governments could implement, have implemented elsewhere, have implemented previously in Australia. And you and I have discussed this recently. This is sort of a comment and a question. We're always told that people switch off when they're presented with bad news stories. I'm often asked, oh, but what gives you hope? Actually, I think fear is a far bigger motivator than hope. Otherwise, none of us would have insurance. None of us would get vaccinations. I don't actually think it's the bad news that's the problem. I think it's the fact that governments have actively blocked the solutions. We need to hear how bad things are. We owe people like you our gratitude for sounding the alarm, for doing the work that we can't or don't have the appetite to do. We just need our leaders to make it easy for us to do something about it. Would you agree with that?
Look, I absolutely would agree with that. And I think that the thing that really I find most difficult about this conversation is that the solutions that we need to turn it all around already exist. And so we're having this conversation that seems to be going around in circles. And I think that really what I was looking at in the essay was this sort of scientific reality check and asking whether the climate wars are really over. And I also asked the question, or has a new era of greenwashing just begun? But I guess in fairness, I mean, the Labor government has made some progress towards enacting climate policy compared to the previous coalition government. So we've seen things like legislating Australia's net zero by 2050 emissions target, scaling up of renewables, and placing tighter restriction on industrial emissions. But in truth, the federal government's actions really still don't reflect the urgency of this sort of planetary scale crisis that we're facing. And it's been really disappointing to see Labor's continued support for the fossil fuel industry and also policies that are littered with these loopholes like the carbon offsetting scheme associated with the safeguard mechanism. Because to be honest, planting a few trees is not going to get us out of the mess we're in. And expecting the land sector to do all of the heavy lifting to reduce our emissions fails to address the root cause of the problem. And we actually know that the burning of fossil fuels is responsible for around 80% of carbon emissions, with the remaining 20% generated from land use changes like deforestation and the degradation of ecosystems. And so we also know that Australia's greenhouse gas emissions are continuing to rise. So it's pretty clear that our climate policies are failing. And so we really, I guess for me, what I really wanted to do with this essay was put this scientific reality check alongside a policy reality check and then leave the reader. I guess it's good to hear that you were angry because I also felt angry writing this essay as well. In the past, I've written a lot about my heartbreak. And actually, as I was writing the end of the essay, the Great Barrier Reef was bleaching. The fourth global mass coral bleaching event was unfolding. And for me, I'm just starting to become completely infuriated by the situation. It makes me realise that, what do we need to lose? How bad does it need to get before we actually start doing something that really gets to the heart of the issue, which is really, I know it's difficult, but it is shutting down the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, thank you for that. And having said that, well, it's double-barreled and it's also basically getting you to sum up the essay. Having said that, how bad is it? How bad are things? And I'm not just going to get you to leave it there. What has to happen? Like, you've alluded to them. Give me 3 things that the Australian government needs to announce for them to be credibly responding to climate change.
Yeah, and this is a terrific question. So let's deal with the first part first, which is how bad is it? And so unfortunately, I guess I'm here to say that the situation is worse than most people realise. And like I said, I was trying to provide a scientific reality check on the state of the global climate, an update on how we're doing in terms of tracking our the Paris Agreement goals, and also what failure of climate policy means for Australia. And so last year was one for the books. So 2023 was the world's warmest year on record, the warmest in at least 125,000 years, and where conditions were so extreme that it led to really unusual behaviour in the climate system. And it had scientists really worried that we may be seeing the precursors of abrupt climate change in certain aspects of the climate system. And it's actually the reason why I took time away from my scientific research to write this essay, because despite all of the talk, the world is still disastrously off track to stabilise emissions by 2050. And I think some people forget that a lot of these net zero pledges rely really heavily on carbon capture and storage or other offsetting measures. Before I mentioned the carbon offsetting scheme with the safeguard mechanisms to get us to that 2050 net zero by 2050. So it's something I talk a lot about in the essay. But I guess what I want to say right now to the group this morning is that collectively the world is failing to reduce emissions at the scale and the speed that we need to avoid dangerous levels of climate change, which is the overall goal of the Paris Agreement. So the science tells us that we need a 43% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. But if you have a look at the figures that were provided by the global stocktake conducted at COP28 in Dubai last year, it showed that current policies are on track to reduce emissions by just 2% of that 43% that is needed by 2030. And even if we enact all those net zero policies, we're still really looking at 5% reduction rather than that 43%. So really, in other words, under the best case scenario, collectively, we are still not on track to reduce emissions. And as far as I'm concerned, and I sort of say this in the essay, it's a policy failure of colossal proportions. And I guess the implications of that are that right now, there's a 90% chance that the continuation of current policies will see the world warm by 2.3 to 4.5 degrees by the end of this century, with a best estimate of 3.5. So that's current policies. But in a best case scenario where we have all those net zero pledges honoured, we're still looking at warming of between 2 and 3 degrees. So clearly that represents a catastrophic overshooting of the Paris Agreement targets. And it just highlights just how far off track we really are. And again, as a reality check, 1.5 degrees is likely to be breached as soon as the late 2020s or the early 2030s. So I guess in a nutshell, that's how bad it is. And I guess I detail a lot of the conditions that we experience around the world. And so I won't go into it here, but I encourage you to read the essay. But the second part of your question is a really important one. And I guess it's the thing in terms of what it is that we need to do to turn things around. And I guess the worst thing about this whole situation is that most people don't seem to understand that it's possible to reduce emissions between 50 and 80% using technologies that are available right now. And these are studies that have been conducted by the IPCC or the International Energy Agency and the CSIRO. And so I guess if I had my top three in terms of things to do, the first thing we need to do is to stop burning fossil fuels. They are responsible for over 80% of emissions, and they remain in the atmosphere for centuries. And the science tells us that about 60% of oil and gas reserves and 90% of coal must remain unextracted if warming is to be limited to 1.5 degrees. But as I guess many people on the call, and you certainly know this, Polly, that there are plans for over 100 fossil fuel developments here in Australia, mostly gas projects in Western Australia and the Northern Territory, and they're looking to operate for decades to come. And as this essay was going to print, the ALP's future gas strategy came out, which was showing that we're looking at locking in fossil fuel use and infrastructure, they say, until 2050 and beyond, which is entirely incompatible with the scientific reality that we're facing. So I guess that's the number one. The number two is that we need to remove fossil fuel subsidies to give renewable energy a fair go and to allow the industry to develop. So while there has been some good progress made in the areas of things like renewable energy and supporting green manufacturing, the truth is that we're still heavily subsidising the fossil fuel industry. And so this is where I was reading a lot of Australia Institute work. There have been some fantastic reports that have really shone a light in dark places. And it basically shows that here in Australia last year, state and federal governments provided over $14.5 billion in fossil fuel subsidies. So that's, again, really incompatible with what the science says we need to do. And why this matters is because what governments do to support polluting industries influences the public and private investment that's going on right now. So if we undermine the transition to renewable energy by locking in fossil fuel-based infrastructure for decades to come, it's just not a fair fight. So we really do need to see, we just need to remove these subsidies. There's no way around it. And I guess alongside that, or an extension of that, is that the government needs to have the guts to put a price on carbon to incentivise the decarbonisation of the economy. So instead of the polluter pays principle, right now the Australian taxpayer is footing the bill for supporting the fossil fuel industry. And that's something that you and I, Polly, have talked about in the past. And when I was trying to get my head around what is failing with policy, it really helped those conversations that we were having. So I think that our leaders need to obviously put a price on carbon and accelerate the clean energy transition, because we know we can be this renewable energy superpower. But most people don't realise that we're actually the sunniest continent on the planet, and less than 15% of our electricity comes from solar. So not only are we blessed with the richest solar and also wind resources in the world, we're still failing. For me, it's a form of madness. So clearly we don't have our priorities straight, and the fossil fuel industry has a stranglehold on our parliament. So that is really something that has to change if we're really going to get any traction. And the last thing I would recommend is we need to start restoring these carbon-rich ecosystems like forests, and stop logging native forests that have the ability to keep carbon in long-term storage. So once you release that carbon, the genie's out of the bottle there. So I guess there's a lot in that question of yours, but I hope that I've covered the key points.
I think so, yes. Well, it was a lot. What I'm going to do is just summarise, I think, the four things that people are kind of hungry to know what would look like in good policy. So first, we need to stop we need to stop doing harm. Okay, tell me if this is right. Stop approving new gas and coal projects. Don't announce a future gas strategy, maybe, saying that we're going to be opening new gas basins. Second, stop subsidising the problem. Stop subsidising the industry that we are trying to get rid of. Economics is pretty simple. You subsidise and incentivise the things you want more of. You tax or penalise the things you want less of. We're still subsidising and incentivising and de-risking fossil fuels. So let's stop doing that. Well, the government should announce if it was having credible climate policy. What was the other one? Oh, okay, this is the penalise or tax the things you want less of. We want less carbon in the atmosphere. So sorry, guys, we're going to have to tax or put a price on carbon. So polluters just have to pay more if they want to pollute. That's a really great way of disincentivizing pollution. It's worked elsewhere. It worked in Australia for a while. The other one is we need to stop native forest logging. We need to stop deforestation, and we need to protect those natural carbon sinks. Not as an offset, and that's a very big and. So have I summed up the four? It's pretty simple. Summed up the
Absolutely.
4 things?
Yeah, that's brilliant, Polly. And thank you for your clarity on that. And I think that's really what it comes down to. And unfortunately, we are having this inane debate in Australia about how hard it needs to be and all this sort of thing, where the reality is the solutions exist right now. And as you said in your introduction, this diversion into nuclear power, I talk about it a bit in the essay, but because it's just so off the wall in terms of, what we need to do right now, I don't think any credible expert would really put forward nuclear power as a viable solution in a country like Australia. So all of that is a diversion. And so, as you just summarised, we do have solutions right now, but the thing that's missing is the political will.
Yeah. That is something you mentioned before, was about that overshoot of 1.5 degrees. I want to ask you a question about this, because I think in Australia there is a tendency to be kind of flippant. I've just seen a couple of comments there, what's it going to look like at 3 or 4 degrees? I'm not saying the people are flippant, but I don't think we really have a full understanding of how bad that is. So to be clear, the Paris Agreement, this international treaty between countries who have said they will implement changes in their countries to limit warming to 1.5 degrees of global warming above industrial temperatures. In 2018, the former president of Kiribati, this kind of really nails it for me, wrote an op-ed, and he said half a degree of warming may seem trifling, but for my country, Kiribati, these fractional figures are a matter of life and death. Can you explain why it is so important that 1.5 degrees remains our ultimate goal. Like, that's what we're going for. I understand under current policies, things aren't looking great, but we need to really, I'll just, why is it so important?
Yeah, and again, a really good question. And it's good to come back to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the goal is to avoid dangerous human interference with the climate system. And so remember, I talked about my motivator for writing this essay was 2023. And, there were some really unusual things happening in the climate system that were really worrying people. So I guess what I wanted to talk about is really that some of the latest research on climate tipping points shows that abrupt climate change is actually possible within the Paris Agreement levels of global warming. So under 2 degrees, we've actually found that it's possible to tip elements of the climate system. So it's possible that right now we've exceeded the tipping point for the world's coral reef systems, which we're already seeing that right now, and also the Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheets. And so in the essay, I talk about this, the West Antarctic, a little bit because it's really important, and I'll explain why. So what happened in the middle of the Southern Hemisphere winter last year is that an area of sea ice, that basically the size of Western Australia, was just failed to form. It was just missing. And statistically speaking, it was basically 7 standard deviations away from the long-term average, which is a phenomenal departure away from normal conditions. And experts now believe that we may be experiencing the beginning of what they've termed an abrupt critical transition that will result in the inevitable disintegration of the West Antarctic ice sheet. And why that's important is that the West Antarctic ice sheet on its own has the potential to raise global sea level by 4 metres. And there's also another 7 metres locked up in the Antarctic. So the problem is that once we melt ice sheets, and this is really what I'm very concerned about right now, and comes back to your point about 1.5, is that once we melt ice sheets, these changes are considered permanent and irreversible on timescales of tens to thousands of years, because it takes that long to actually form an ice sheet. So, and if we're thinking about, the impacts of, say, a low-lying nation like Kiribati and our other Pacific neighbours, if you think about, coastal experts basically have a rule of thumb that for every 1 metre of sea level rise, it results in about 100 metres of retreat in the coastline. And so that's the loss of our beaches, erosion of the coastline. Here in Australia, much of our critical infrastructure, like airports in places like Sydney and Brisbane, are also located in those types of areas. So we're really talking about major disruption, not only to the climate system, but obviously to society. So I guess there's really no more time to delay. There's no more fat in the system. And I guess this is really the thing for me, because right now, when we talk 0.5, and you and I have also talked about this a lot over last year or so, it is really disturbing to know that right now we are currently on track for that major overshoot of that 1.5 degrees. So according to the United Nations Environment Programme's emissions gap report, even if all net zero pledges are honoured, there's only really a 14% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. As I mentioned before, current policies have us on track for 3.5. So, but just because we're going to overshoot, that's not to say that we should be abandoning the goal of 1.5. Actually, what it means is that we should be redoubling our effort and trying to understand where and why we are failing. So, and the way I was thinking about it is like, if you had if you had like a treatable cancer, for instance, like if a doctor said to you, you have a cancer, but it's treatable. So if your mum or your partner or your child had cancer and the doctor said it was treatable, wouldn't you do everything you possibly could to actually treat it? Or would you just say, oh, well, you got cancer, game over, I'm not even going to try with this? So I guess also just with this medical analogy, the longer you delay, the fewer treatment options are available. So I guess climate scientists are now trying to warn the public that we're facing an emergency situation and we need rapid action. And as you said, and this is one of the key results from the IPCC's report, is that every fraction of a degree matters. So the other thing that's in the IPCC report that doesn't often get talked about is that there are very hard limits to climate change adaptation. So they basically say beyond 2 degrees of global warming, we're looking at conditions that become hostile for much of human activity. And And just quickly, the reality of like, say, a 2-degree warm, 2-degree world here in Australia means that we start to see the beginning of 50-degree temperatures in places like Sydney and Melbourne. By 3 degrees, those sorts of extreme levels of heat become a regular feature of the Australian summer. And if we continue down this high emissions pathway, then we really start to see really fundamental changes. So, for instance, Sydney takes on the subtropical climate of Brisbane, and Melbourne transitions to the aridity that's currently experienced in a place like Adelaide. So, again, really fundamental shifts in the climate system. And the other thing I talk about in the essay is that everybody knows about the Black Summer bushfires in 2019, 2020, but under this fossil fuel intensive pathway, they would become average by 2040 and exceptionally cool by 2060. So the stakes couldn't be any higher. And sometimes we forget in a country like Australia, there's so much to lose. And what we do in the 2020s will really make or break our ability to live safely on this planet. And we really only have one chance to get this right. So we can't reverse engineer our way out of it. And I spend a lot of time talking about carbon capture and storage. So probably won't go into it here, but it's not the silver bullet that we need. Actually, the silver bullet exists. It's the political will that seems to be missing. So, I mean, I can talk about this all day, obviously, but maybe I guess I want to let people know that I really believe that the next Australian federal election could be the most important one in our nation's history, because as the third largest exporter of fossil fuels, what we do really matters. And it doesn't just matter, it matters from the moral perspective, economic perspective, and the environmental perspective as well. So we need to take a stand on this, because we can get it wrong. And if we get it wrong and we tip the ice sheets, then we are really talking about those irreversible levels of climate change. So that's really what climate scientists like me are trying to say as clearly as possible, so people really truly understand what's at risk, but also the opportunities that are there for us.
So I might just add something to that. To be, you talk about climate change, climate scientists like me, and what we're saying. I just want to make clear to everyone that this is not Joelle's opinion. This is not a matter of opinion. This is a matter of physics, and climate scientists are the messengers. So often when people like Joëlle speak, they're asked for the solutions and, how do you expect us to turn the lights off overnight? To be clear, no one's ever said that, but that's the response climate scientists get. Joëlle is delivering science. She's delivering fact. She can't be asked what the solution is, because that's not her job, really. The solution is to stop burning fossil fuels and to stop putting it out there. So I just wanted to, kind of really emphasize that, because I think there's a real hunger to know what the answers are, but these are questions that should be directed towards politicians. Unfortunately, when they are directed to politicians, you get a response that is indecipherable about, it's going to take a long time to do this. This is very, we can't rush this, and blah, 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 blah. And it's not an adequate answer, but I'm just saying, because you don't get an adequate answer, then people look elsewhere. I don't blame anyone for that. I do the same thing. It's, well, tell me what to do then. So that's not a question. I was just kind of highlighting that to everyone. We're going to turn to audience questions now, but the theme that is coming through from all the questions really is, well, how do we do anything about this? So I will get to individual questions, but this kind of sums it up. And again, Joëlle is a scientist, so she actually doesn't have all the answers. It's up to our leaders to take on the science and then act in our best interests. What can people do? I'm going to throw in my 2 cents, Joëlle, if you don't mind, just because I think it's an unreasonable burden to put on you to say what can people do. I mean, read the science, listen to people like Joëlle, get angry. Someone in the chat really nicely said it's time to get determined. We're less than a year away from a federal election now. People, if you want to make change, buy your keep cups, take personal responsibility, stop flying, stop eating meat and all that. but there's a lot of very nervous people in the party room right now who are very concerned about losing their seats. And as my boss, Richard Dennett, says, the things politicians fear most is pain and the threat of pain. And as we've seen with the changes to the stage 3 tax cuts, to Julian Assange being brought home, pressure works. So this is an ideal time now to be putting as much pressure on your local MP as possible, sharing research, signing the petitions that we've put in the chat, report greenwashing. The ACCC responds to a critical mass of complaints. Engaging democratically, we've got no time, as others have said, we're in a cost of living crisis. Engaging democratically is probably the most powerful thing that you can do, and not feeling guilty that you feel powerless as well. Is that fair to say? That, again, that's not a question, but I just want to take the burden off you of having to have all the answers for people.
Thanks, Polly. I appreciate that. I guess it's true. Scientists, we don't have all the answers, but for this essay, I did read over 220 different reports and articles and all that sort of stuff to try and sift through where the answers lie and try and put it alongside the scientific reality. So it wasn't an easy job, but I think it was an important job. And thank you for also noting that this essay is not opinion. It is evidence-based, so we can all have a rational conversation and be on solid ground. So I guess that was really, I guess, what I wanted to do with this essay was provide people with a way of understanding, well, how bad is it? Is it going to get worse? And what can we do? And you touch on, I think, something that is really important, because I do think that, I mean, firstly, I guess it's been really interesting for me to watch this nuclear power conversation play out, because I guess people's level of scientific literacy is really alarming for someone like me. And so I guess it's really makes me think, well, how much do we actually need to understand about the ins and outs of climate science and that sort of thing to do what we know is just ethically and morally right? We know what is causing global warming, right? So we need to just have the awareness around that, and then placing the political pressure on the people that are enacting the policies that run our country. But, it's just sort of like saying, if you had a heart condition, do you need to go off and become a cardiologist to understand every single thing? And I think we've lost a lot of time. And people like me have actually genuinely engaged in that conversation, thinking, well, if I teach people about this, they'll understand. Some people don't care. And maybe that's all right. But we're in a situation now where we need enough people to care that, as I mentioned, we are starting to destabilise the Earth's climate that has been stable for at least 10,000 years in the current state that we're in right now. And it's going to be really hostile to human activity. So there's a lot of, I guess, conversation that goes on that I feel like is a bit of a diversion. So I guess what you're trying to do in this conversation, I can see, is trying to direct us back into what it is that we can do. And I think we just need to be aware of the problem, and we also need to make our vote count. So this is not the time to stay apolitical and on the sidelines. And that's why people like me, who this is not my usual kind of terrain in terms of engaging in public political conversation, because as a result, that sees people like me attacked, people saying I'm not being objective, and that it's not the role of scientists to weigh into political conversation. That can also be career limiting in terms of being able to secure government funding and so on and so forth. But I'm at the point where I can't, the price of silence feels intolerable to me. And so the people who do know a lot about this problem often don't engage in the public conversation, because it also invites trouble your way. As I found, you become a target, and that can derail your career. So I won't go into all of that, but it's not for the faint-hearted. But I guess what I'm trying to do, and this is why it's, in some ways, it feels like probably the most important piece I might write for some time, is because we as a nation, what we do really matters. As the great work of the Australia Institute has really shone a light on the fossil fuel subsidies and our role as an exporter and what that means. And so I guess it's up to us as citizens to really get behind leaders that really reflect our values of a livable planet and equity and a green economy that can thrive. And we just have to be prepared to let go of the status quo and realise that the age of fossil fuels has to come to an end. And propping them up with subsidies until the bitter end is only going to lock in warming that will be with us for thousands of years. And I guess that's what is really worrying me, to the point of putting aside my own research, is because once you tip those ice sheets, we are really talking about those irreversible aspects of climate change that keep people like me up at night.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Follow the Money. If you want to join our Australia's Biggest Book Club webinars live, you can sign up via our website at australiainstitute.org.au, or you can follow the link in the show notes. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today. You can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Blue Sky at australiainstitute.org.au. Don't forget, you can order your copy of the first book from Australia Institute Press today. What's the Big Idea offers 32 big ideas for a better Australia from leading thinkers such as Yanis Varoufakis, Amy Ramikis, Auntie Pat Anderson, and Professor Peter Doherty. You can order it now via our website. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Adam Gottschalk. Thank you for listening.